Welcome in. For most of human history, people looked up at the night sky and assumed someone was in charge. The stars moved with remarkable precision. The seasons returned. The sun rose exactly where it was supposed to. The universe appeared orderly, intentional, designed. But what if that feeling is wrong? What if the strange discomfort that sometimes arrives late at night, the feeling that something about the world does not quite fit, isn't a mistake? Nearly 2,000 years ago, a collection of religious movements emerged around a startling possibility. The world, they said, may not have been created by the highest God. The Creator may not even understand the universe He built. According to these thinkers, human beings are not fully at home in the world around them. We are strangers living inside a reality that has forgotten its own origins. They called the awakening to this truth gnosis. Knowledge. Not the kind found in books. The kind that changes how you see everything. Tonight, we are following one of the strangest ideas in religious history. A story of hidden gods, forgotten worlds, buried gospels, cosmic maps, and a persistent feeling that reality itself may be only part of a much larger picture. So find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights if you can. And together, let's wander into the strange and dreamlike world of Gnosticism. There is no rush to understand any of this completely. No rush here. The small details can arrive before the larger meaning does. The first concrete detail gives what is Gnosticism a surface to stand on before the larger meaning widens around it. You can listen for a while, or let it settle into the room. Before the story settles in, just a brief note. This video is built for low light, soft narration, and background ambience that stays gentle instead of pulling attention. Before we begin, you can leave a small note with where in the world you are listening from, if you are comfortable sharing it generally. If this helps you rest, subscribing lets the channel know to keep making more slow stories like this. Now, let's begin. The sky was once a map for meaning. Welcome in. There is no rush to understand any of this completely. Some ideas arrive slowly. They drift at the edge of awareness for a while before settling into focus. Often, the smallest details appear first, while the larger shape remains hidden somewhere beyond them. Tonight's story begins with one of those details, a person lying beneath an unfamiliar sky. A feeling that something is not quite where it should be, and a question that has followed humanity for centuries. Before the story settles in, just a brief note. This video is designed for quiet listening, low light, and gentle background ambience. A place for curiosity rather than urgency. If you'd like, you can leave a note about where in the world you're listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these late-night journeys travel. And if these slow explorations help you rest, subscribing is a simple way of letting the channel know you'd like more. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. A Night Under Foreign Stars. Long before anyone wrote the word Gnosticism, before forgotten scrolls were buried beneath Egyptian sand, before philosophers argued over the nature of reality, there was a simpler experience. Looking up, and feeling uncertain about what was looking back. Picture a traveler stretched across a hillside far from any city. The cloak is pulled tightly against the night's chill. Moisture gathers in the grass. A stone presses into the small of the back with the kind of persistence that makes sleep difficult, but not impossible. The world is quiet, not silent. Somewhere in the distance, an animal moves through dry brush. Insects carry on their patient conversations. Wind brushes across the hillside and disappears again. Above it all hangs a sky filled with stars. But something feels unfamiliar. The constellations do not arrange themselves into recognizable shapes. The patterns seem incomplete, almost accidental. A few stars suggest meaning, then drift apart again. The eye keeps trying to connect them into something coherent. A map, a message, a story, anything. For most of human history, the night sky was far more than decoration. It was a calendar, a compass, a clock, a source of warnings and hopes. People searched those distant lights for evidence that the universe made sense. Sometimes it seemed to. The stars moved with astonishing regularity. Seasons arrived when expected. Certain patterns returned year after year with reassuring precision. Yet there were interruptions. A wandering planet, a comet, a strange light where no light should be. Moments when the heavens appeared to break their own rules. And when that happened, a difficult question emerged. Was the universe truly ordered? Or were human beings simply very good at imagining order where none existed? That uncertainty lingered. Centuries later, it would find one of its most unusual expressions in a collection of beliefs we now call Gnosticism. The word comes from the Greek term gnosis, knowledge, but not the ordinary kind, not facts, not information, not the knowledge gained from study alone. Gnosis referred to something far stranger, an awakening, a recognition, the sudden realization that the reality you have always trusted may only be the surface of something much deeper. Many Gnostic thinkers believed the world was not what it appeared to be. The trees, the stones, the stars overhead, even the passage of time itself, all of it belonged to a reality that was incomplete, a copy rather than an original, a shadow rather than a source. Behind it, they believed, existed something older and more real, something hidden, something forgotten. The ancient texts discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt speak of these ideas in language that is often dreamlike and difficult to pin down. Their pages describe realms beyond ordinary existence, distant divine beings, and a truth concealed beneath the visible world. Most striking of all is their treatment of creation itself. Many Gnostics proposed that the being responsible for creating the material universe was not the highest God. The Creator was powerful, certainly, but perhaps also limited, perhaps unaware, perhaps trapped within an ignorance of his own. The suggestion remains startling even now. The world may not be broken because something went wrong within it. The world may be broken because its maker never fully understood what lay beyond it. This is where the emotional center of Gnosticism begins to emerge. Not rebellion, not anger, homesickness. To believe that a higher reality exists beyond the visible world is also to accept a painful possibility. You may not entirely belong here. The familiar world becomes slightly unfamiliar. The stars still shine. The grass still grows. Morning still follows night. Yet everything acquires a subtle distance, as though reality itself has shifted half a step away. Like waking in a house that resembles your own, but contains someone else's furniture. The details are recognizable. The feeling is not. The traveler on the hillside knows nothing of ancient theology, nothing of hidden gods or forgotten realms. Yet the sensation is there all the same. The cold, the darkness, the restless urge to find meaning among scattered lights. Human beings have always searched for patterns, a shape in the stars, a message in coincidence, a reason for suffering, a hint that existence belongs to a larger story. The Gnostics simply carried that search into unusual territory. They wondered whether the ache itself might be evidence, whether the feeling that something is missing points towards something that has been lost. Their writings are often fragmented, uneven, contradictory. One text describes a God beyond all language. Another introduces strange cosmic beings with names that seem to belong to dreams. A third begins answering one mystery, only to uncover several more. Reading them can feel like wandering through ruins by lantern light. Every corridor appears to lead somewhere important. Every doorway opens onto another question. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why these ideas continue to fascinate people, not because they provide clear answers, but because they speak to a feeling many people recognize, the sense that ordinary reality is somehow incomplete, that something important sits just beyond reach. Maybe the stars are only stars. Maybe the world is exactly what it appears to be. Or maybe the reason stories like Gnosticism survive is because they give shape to a feeling that never entirely disappears. The hope that there is a home beyond the one we know. And the quiet suspicion that we have forgotten the way back. The traveler remains awake. Dawn is still hours away. Somewhere in the darkness, something moves through the grass. Perhaps a fox. Perhaps only the wind. Above, the unfamiliar constellations continue their slow journey across the sky. And beneath them, a question waits. Not yet answered. Only beginning. Chapter 2. The Whisper of Gnosis. Some knowledge changes what you know. Other knowledge changes where you stand. The Gnostics were interested in the second kind. To them, Gnosis did not mean collecting facts or memorizing teachings. It was not the sort of thing a person could acquire by listening carefully to a lecture or spending long afternoons copying scrolls. It was closer to recognition, a sudden and unsettling clarity. The feeling that something hidden had quietly stepped into view. For the old Gnostic thinkers, Gnosis was an experience before it was an idea. A direct encounter with truth so personal that it could not easily be handed from one person to another. You could describe it. You could point toward it. You could write entire libraries about it. Yet the thing itself remained strangely private, like trying to explain what it feels like to wake from a dream while part of the dream is still clinging to you. Picture a worn leather pouch. The leather has darkened with age and use. The drawstring is tied with an awkward knot, the kind made quickly by someone who intends to return later and never quite does. Inside rests a folded strip of papyrus. The edges are brittle. The fibers crackle softly when unfolded. A faint smell of dust rises from the page, carrying with it the scent of dry rooms, old shelves, and forgotten years. The writing is Greek, though not the polished Greek of official documents. The letters wander slightly. Some lines fade where damp fingers have touched them too often. Reading it requires patience. You squint. You tilt the page toward the light. You trace a word with your thumb. Perhaps a familiar name appears. Sophia, wisdom, or perhaps Yaldabaoth. A name that seems to belong more to a dream than to ordinary conversation. The text feels unusual before you even understand what it says, as though it knows it was never meant to survive. During the 2nd century, carrying such a document could attract unwanted attention. One of the most determined critics of these ideas was a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyon. He devoted enormous effort to cataloguing and attacking what he considered dangerous teachings. From his perspective, these writings threatened the foundations of Christian belief. From the perspective of those preserving them, the danger looked very different. They believed the danger was ignorance. So the text traveled quietly, folded into sleeves, hidden beneath clothing, tucked inside storage jars, passed from hand to hand with the kind of caution usually reserved for fragile objects. There is something almost ordinary about this process. When grand ideas are forced underground, survival becomes surprisingly practical. The history of Gnosticism is filled not only with visions and revelations, but with knots, hiding places, dusty shelves, and careful whispers. The great mysteries of existence often depend on very mundane acts of preservation. What made these texts unusual was not merely that they claimed to contain hidden knowledge. Many traditions made similar claims. What unsettled people was the possibility they raised about the world itself. According to many Gnostic accounts, the creator of the material universe was not the highest divine reality. The being responsible for shaping the visible world, the figure later called the Demiurge, appears as something stranger. Powerful, confident, certain of his own authority, yet somehow unaware of what exists beyond him. It is a curious image. Not a devil, not exactly a tyrant, more like a ruler who mistakes the boundaries of his kingdom for the boundaries of existence itself. A being trapped by his own certainty. That possibility carried unsettling implications. If the Creator did not fully understand reality, what did that say about the world he created? And what did it say about the people living within it? The Gnostic answer was not despair, at least not entirely. Hidden within human beings, they believed, was something older than the world itself. A fragment, a spark, a memory. Gnosis was the moment that spark recognized its origin. The moment a person remembered something they had never consciously known. One ancient saying captures the idea beautifully. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. The line sounds simple at first, almost comforting, but the longer it lingers, the stranger it becomes. What exactly is hidden within? And why would salvation require remembering rather than learning? Questions like these gave Gnosticism its distinctive atmosphere. It did not ask people to look upward, so much as inward. Not toward public rituals or visible authority, but toward an inner realization that could not easily be measured or verified. This made the movement deeply personal, and often deeply lonely. Most people never encountered Gnostic texts directly. They encountered rumors. Stories passed through neighborhoods and marketplaces. A distant relative who became fascinated with strange teachings. A merchant who spoke too often about hidden worlds. A neighbor who started asking uncomfortable questions about the nature of reality. The vast majority of people remained occupied with more immediate concerns. Harvests, debts, weather, illness. The next meal. The next winter. The next year. Against the backdrop of ordinary life, Gnosticism often appeared as a faint whisper at the edge of hearing, easy to dismiss, difficult to forget. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is that these ideas survived at all. Many texts disappeared. Others were destroyed. Some vanished so completely that historians only learned of their existence through the complaints of their opponents. Yet a surprising number endured, buried beneath Egyptian soil, hidden in sealed jars, forgotten for centuries, before reappearing beneath layers of dust and sand. The odds were not in their favor, and yet they remained. There is something fitting about that. A tradition centered on hidden knowledge became hidden itself. A movement devoted to forgotten truths spent centuries forgotten. Then, slowly, fragments began to emerge again. A scrap of papyrus, a damaged codex, a half-preserved page rescued from time, each one carrying the same persistent question forward. What if the deepest truths are not discovered? What if they are remembered? The traveler beneath the unfamiliar stars may not know the answer. Neither do we. But somewhere, folded inside an old leather pouch, a fragile text waits patiently in the dark, its pages yellowing, its edges crumbling, its questions surviving. And with each passing hand, the knot loosens a little further. Chapter 3. The Craftsman in the Dark. By now, a pattern may be starting to emerge. The Gnostics did not look at the world and see pure chaos. That would have been too simple. Instead, they saw something stranger. A world that almost worked. A reality filled with beauty and intelligence, yet also crowded with flaws that seemed impossible to ignore. The stars moved in elegant patterns. Bodies healed from injury. Seeds became forests. Yet people suffered. Things aged. Buildings crumbled. Promises failed. Every beautiful thing appeared to carry the seed of its own disappearance. For many Gnostic thinkers, this contradiction demanded an explanation, and so they imagined one of the most unusual figures in religious history: the Demiurge, the craftsman in the dark. Imagine an old workshop, not the polished sort built for display, but one that has been used for decades. A place where work actually happens. The workbench is scarred by years of effort. A hammer rests where it was dropped. Wood shavings collect in corners. A bent nail has been hammered straight and used again. One shelf leans slightly to the left because nobody ever got around to fixing it. The room functions, but it is not perfect. Nothing inside it is. Run your hand across the bench and you feel rough patches, dents, and old mistakes buried beneath newer ones. Every workshop carries a history of things that almost went according to plan. The Gnostics imagined the universe in much the same way. According to many of their stories, the material world was not created directly by the highest divine reality. Instead, it was shaped by a lesser being, a craftsman, a builder, a maker of worlds. This figure became known as the Demiurge. In some texts, he is called Yaldabaoth. The name arrives suddenly in the ancient writings, strange and unfamiliar, carrying the weight of something remembered from a dream. Unlike the true God, who exists beyond matter and beyond description, the Demiurge works with materials: stars, mountains, bodies, time itself. He assembles the visible world piece by piece, and according to many Gnostic accounts, he does so without fully understanding what he is creating. That is the crucial detail. The Demiurge is not always portrayed as evil. Sometimes he is arrogant, sometimes blind, sometimes confused. Often he appears to be all three at once. He believes himself to be the highest power because he cannot see beyond the limits of his own workshop. Like a craftsman locked inside a building with no windows, he mistakes the room for the entire world. The image carries a surprising amount of sympathy. After all, ignorance and malice are not the same thing. Many Gnostic writers seem less interested in condemning the Demiurge than in explaining him. He becomes a tragic figure, a builder attempting a task larger than his understanding, a creator working from incomplete instructions, a craftsman who never saw the original design. Why imagine such a being? Part of the answer may lie in ordinary experience. The world often feels unfinished, not catastrophically broken, just slightly off. A door that sticks every winter, a roof that leaks during heavy rain, a body that refuses to heal as quickly as it once did. The bread burns because you looked away for a moment. The harvest fails despite careful preparation. The plans were good. The outcome was not. For the Gnostics, these imperfections were not merely inconveniences. They were clues. Evidence that the visible world might be the product of limitation rather than perfection. According to some traditions, the story begins with Sophia, wisdom, one of the great divine beings of the higher realms. through an act that remains mysterious even within the texts themselves. Sophia gives rise to the Demiurge. The details shift from one account to another. The myths rarely stay still for long, but the result is consistent. A creator emerges who is separated from the fullness of divine reality. And from that separation, the material cosmos begins. Stars ignite. Worlds take shape. Living creatures appear. History starts moving. The workshop comes alive. Yet something remains missing. Like a manuscript copied from another manuscript, until entire pages have disappeared. The shape survives. The completeness does not. This idea gives Gnostic mythology its distinctive emotional texture. The world is not rejected. It is mourned. There is beauty everywhere. The Gnostics never denied that. The night sky still inspires wonder. Rivers still glitter in sunlight. Human beings still love, dream, create, and hope. But beneath every beautiful thing lies a subtle awareness of fragility, a sense that something has been forgotten, something essential. That feeling appears again and again throughout the surviving texts. Not hatred for the world, longing beyond it. And perhaps that is why the image of the Demiurge remains so memorable. Everyone has encountered work that almost succeeded. A painting left unfinished. A building designed brilliantly, except for one impossible staircase. A machine that functions perfectly until it doesn't. The Demiurge becomes a cosmic version of that familiar experience. A maker whose creation contains both brilliance and error, order and confusion, beauty and limitation. The divine spark, meanwhile, remains trapped within the workshop. According to many Gnostic traditions, part of humanity originates from a reality higher than the one surrounding it, a fragment of something older, something that remembers, something that looks around the world and feels, however faintly, that it was meant for more than this. That sensation can sound bleak at first, yet many people find it strangely comforting. If the feeling of not quite belonging is shared by others, perhaps it is not a personal failure. Perhaps it is part of the human condition itself, a homesickness without a remembered home. Of course, no single version of the Demiurge exists. The surviving texts disagree constantly. Some barely mention him. Others place him at the center of everything. Historians continue debating how these myths developed and how different communities understood them. The evidence is fragmented. Much of what survives reached us through critics who hoped these ideas would disappear. Yet despite the gaps, the image endures. A workshop lit by uncertain light. A craftsman bent over creation. Tools scattered across the bench. Instructions missing pages. Outside, the wind moves softly through the darkness. Inside, the work continues. And somewhere beyond the walls of the workshop, beyond the reach of the builder himself, waits a reality he has never seen. The door remains slightly open. the sounds of another world drift through. And in the next chapter, those distant echoes will begin to take shape. Chapter 4: Marketplaces of Meaning. Ideas travel differently when nobody agrees on where the truth lives. Some are carried by armies, others by priests. Others still pass quietly between strangers who may never meet again. Gnosticism belonged to that third category. It moved through conversations, borrowed languages, chance encounters, and crowded streets. It drifted from one mind to another, the way dust drifts through an open doorway, difficult to track, impossible to stop completely. To understand where these ideas came from, it helps to leave the hillside and the workshop behind for a moment. Instead, imagine a city at dusk. Alexandria, perhaps, or Antioch, or one of the many bustling crossroads where cultures met, collided and occasionally borrowed from one another. The market streets are still busy, despite the fading light. Olive pits crunch beneath passing sandals. Crushed figs sweeten the air. Merchants call from beneath patched awnings stretched between weathered buildings. Lamps flicker awake one by one, turning the gathering darkness gold. Everywhere there is movement. Baskets of bread, bundles of dyed cloth, jars of oil, fish packed in salt, lentils, dates, amulets, scrolls. The ordinary necessities of life arranged beside objects meant for entirely different hungers. A woman purchases grain. A sailor bargains for rope. A traveler pauses at a stall displaying tiny carved symbols whose meanings have already been forgotten by half the city. The market appears chaotic, yet beneath the noise, something else is being exchanged. Stories, explanations, worldviews, ways of understanding existence itself. This is where Gnosticism begins to make more sense, not as a single invention appearing fully formed, but as a collection of ideas moving through an environment already overflowing with competing answers. The first centuries of the Common Era were remarkably crowded intellectually. Judaism flourished. Greek philosophy remained influential. Ancient Egyptian traditions lingered. Mystery religions attracted followers. Christianity was still defining itself. Everywhere people argued, questioned, taught, borrowed, and reinterpreted. The world was connected in ways that often surprise modern observers. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying grain, wine, and textiles. They also carried stories. A merchant could leave one port believing one thing and arrive at another, carrying a slightly different understanding of the cosmos. Ideas traveled alongside cargo, sometimes faster. The result was a kind of spiritual marketplace, not necessarily tolerant, not always peaceful, but undeniably active. A person could encounter multiple explanations for reality within a single afternoon. One teacher might describe the universe through the lens of Plato, another through the traditions of Moses, a third through the teachings of Jesus, a fourth through mysteries that seem to arrive from nowhere at all. The boundaries were often less rigid than we imagine. People borrowed, adapted, experimented. A useful idea was difficult to keep contained. And Gnosticism, perhaps more than most movements, absorbed influences from many directions. Certain themes echo older Jewish traditions. Other concepts resemble Greek philosophical speculation. Christian figures appear throughout many Gnostic texts, though often in unfamiliar roles. Jesus frequently becomes a revealer of hidden truths rather than the central figure of salvation found in later Orthodox Christianity. Even the language shifts depending on which text one happens to be reading. It can feel less like entering a single religion and more like wandering through a district where several neighborhoods overlap. That fluidity is part of what makes Gnosticism so difficult to define and so fascinating. The people involved were rarely trying to create something called Gnosticism. That category would come much later. They were attempting to understand existence using the tools available to them, borrowing where useful, discarding what seemed insufficient, searching for patterns in a world that often felt confusing. Imagine a small gathering behind a bakery. The smell of yeast hangs in the warm air. Someone reads from a scroll. Someone else asks a question. A third person disagrees. Outside, carts rattle over stone streets. Inside, a conversation unfolds about hidden realities, divine sparks, and the possibility that the visible world is not the final layer of existence. No one present knows that historians 2,000 years later will struggle to categorize what is happening. They are simply trying to make sense of things. The surviving evidence suggests this happened constantly, not just among philosophers and scholars, among ordinary people as well. Potters, weavers, merchants, sailors, farmers. People facing the same concerns humans have always faced. Illness, loss, uncertainty, the future. If a teaching helped explain suffering, it attracted attention. If a ritual promised protection, someone might try it. If a story offered hope, it tended to survive. Human beings have always been practical in this regard. The search for meaning is rarely separate from daily life. A person worried about a failed harvest does not necessarily need absolute certainty. Sometimes they only need an explanation that feels slightly less frightening than the alternatives. That practicality helps explain why religious boundaries could become surprisingly porous. A prayer from one tradition, an amulet from another, a philosophical idea borrowed from somewhere else entirely. Many people assembled their understanding of reality from whatever seemed useful. Truth was not always treated as a finished monument. Often, it resembled a collection of fragments gathered over time, pieces fitted together as best they could be. Standing in the middle of such a marketplace, certainty becomes difficult to maintain. Every direction offers another answer, another teacher, another cosmology, another promise. The experience feels oddly familiar. Modern people encounter competing ideas through screens. Ancient people encountered them through streets. The technology changed. The condition remained remarkably similar. A crowded world generates crowded explanations. Perhaps that is why Gnosticism emerged so naturally from environments like these. Its central themes already carried the atmosphere of a crossroads. Multiple influences, multiple voices, multiple attempts to describe something hidden beyond ordinary perception. The movement itself became a reflection of the world that produced it. Layered, fragmented, restless, never entirely settled. As evening deepens, the market begins to empty. Merchants gather their remaining goods. Lamps burn lower. Conversations fade into the growing darkness. Yet some things continue traveling long after the stalls have closed. A scrap of text, a remembered phrase, a strange idea overheard while buying bread, a question that refuses to leave. And so the meaning of Gnosis continues its journey, not carried by armies or kings, but by ordinary people, passed from hand to hand like a rumor too intriguing to forget. The streets grow quieter. The baskets are packed away. The dust settles. And somewhere beyond the market, another story waits to be told. Chapter 5. The Hidden Book. Some secrets survive because they are protected. Others survive because nobody understands them well enough to destroy them. The books of the Gnostics seem to have survived through a little of both. By now, we have wandered beneath unfamiliar stars, stepped inside the workshop of the Demiurge, and listened to ideas drift through crowded marketplaces. Yet all of those places eventually lead to a quieter setting. A small room, a closed door, a single lamp burning late into the night. Picture a clay oil lamp resting on a low wooden table. Its flame flickers whenever a draft finds its way through the cracks in the wall. Shadows stretch and contract across the room. A woolen cloth lies folded beside a leather-bound codex, whose edges have darkened with age and handling. At first glance, there is nothing remarkable about it. Just another book. Just another object among many. Yet the owner keeps glancing toward the doorway. Not out of fear exactly. Out of caution. Some books are easier to explain than others. This chapter begins with a simple observation. Many Gnostic texts were not written for large audiences. They often present themselves as hidden teachings, private conversations, or revelations shared only with a select few. The modern phrase, secret gospel, captures something of that atmosphere, though perhaps not in the way people usually imagine. Today, the word secret tends to suggest buried treasure, lost codes, forbidden maps, a revelation capable of changing history overnight. The reality is often stranger and far less dramatic. Many of these texts conceal their meaning, not because they are locked, but because they are difficult. They read less like instruction manuals and more like puzzles, not messages waiting to be decoded, questions waiting to be lived with. That distinction matters. A hidden teaching is not necessarily hidden because nobody can find it. Sometimes it is hidden because understanding it requires something more than reading. The Gnostics return to this idea repeatedly. Words could point toward truth. They could gesture toward it. but the thing itself remained beyond language. A person might memorize every line and still miss the point entirely. The lamp crackles softly. Outside, footsteps pass in the street. The owner waits until the sounds fade before opening the book. The caution is understandable. Many Gnostic writings challenged assumptions that powerful religious authorities considered essential. To possess such a text was not always dangerous, but it could become dangerous under the wrong circumstances. Ideas have a way of attracting attention, especially ideas that question the nature of God, creation, or reality itself. And so books were hidden, wrapped in cloth, stored in jars, placed behind household objects no visitor would bother examining. The practical details of secrecy rarely resemble the dramatic versions found in stories. More often, they involve dust, patience, and careful habits. A text survives because someone remembered where they left it. One of the most famous examples is the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the familiar narrative Gospels, it contains very little story. There are no journeys across Galilee, no detailed accounts of miracles, no dramatic sequence leading toward a crucifixion. Instead, the text presents a collection of sayings. Some are familiar, others are deeply strange. Many feel unfinished, as though they were deliberately designed to continue unfolding inside the reader long after the page has been closed. One saying declares, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there." Another invites interpretation, but refuses to provide it. Again and again, the text offers fragments rather than explanations, doors rather than destinations. For some readers, this is frustrating. For others, it is precisely the appeal. The Gospel of Thomas does not tell you what to think. It places you in conversation with uncertainty. Other Gnostic writings push even further. The Apocryphon of John attempts to describe vast spiritual realms, divine emanations, cosmic mistakes, and the origins of the material universe itself. Reading it can feel like watching someone sketch a map of a landscape glimpsed only in dreams. The outline appears, then disappears. One image gives way to another. The logic feels simultaneously deliberate and elusive. The further the text reaches, the more difficult certainty becomes. Perhaps that is why these books have fascinated readers for so long. Not because they offer straightforward answers, but because they seem to resist them. Modern audiences sometimes approach these writings expecting revelations, a hidden truth, a missing piece, a final answer. What they often find instead is ambiguity, symbols, contradictions, a persistent refusal to explain everything. The secret, if there is one, remains strangely intact, even after centuries of study. The household surrounding these texts is equally important. Most people in the ancient world could not read. Books were expensive. Writing materials required labor. Copying a manuscript demanded time and skill. A written text already possessed an aura of exclusivity before any secret teaching entered the picture. For many communities, knowledge traveled through conversation rather than pages. Stories were heard, remembered, repeated. A book resting on a shelf carried a kind of mystery simply by existing. And so a curious gap emerged. The text existed. The words existed. Yet access remained limited. Even a gospel left in plain sight could remain hidden from most of the people who passed by it. Perhaps that is one reason Gnostic writers became so interested in the distinction between information and understanding. The two are not always the same thing. A person can hear every word and remain asleep. Another can encounter a single sentence and never see the world quite the same way again. The difference is difficult to measure. The Gnostics called it gnosis. The lamp burns lower. Oil gathers at the edge of the wick. Outside, the sounds of the city fade into occasional murmurs, carried by the wind. Inside, the reader turns another page. Carefully. Not because the text contains forbidden power. Not because it reveals a cosmic conspiracy, but because it contains a possibility. The possibility that reality is deeper than it appears. That understanding cannot always be handed from one person to another. That some truths remain hidden even when written in plain sight. The book eventually closes. The cloth is folded over it once more. Morning will come. The room will return to ordinary concerns. Bread, water, work, conversation. Yet something lingers after the lamp is extinguished. A question, a phrase, a possibility that refuses to disappear. And somewhere in the darkness, between what is written and what is understood, another chapter waits patiently to be opened. Chapter 6. The Heretic's Dilemma. Some beliefs change how you see the world. Others change how the world sees you. For many people drawn toward Gnostic ideas, that second transformation may have been the more immediate concern. A hidden teaching can feel exhilarating in theory. Living with it is another matter. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian communities were becoming increasingly organized. Leaders worked to establish shared teachings, shared texts, and shared boundaries. Questions that had once remained open were gradually receiving official answers. Not everyone agreed with those answers, and history has a habit of becoming less patient with disagreement as institutions grow more confident. This is where the word heresy enters the story. Today, it often sounds dramatic, ancient, almost theatrical. Yet in practice, heresy usually begins with something surprisingly ordinary. A conversation, a question, a different interpretation offered at the wrong moment. The realization that your understanding of the world no longer matches the understanding of those around you. Imagine a narrow street after sunset. The heat of the day has finally begun to fade. Lamps glow behind shuttered windows. The smell of bread, smoke, and yesterday's fish drifts through the evening air. Your sandals strike uneven stone. The sound echoes farther than it should. The city is settling into darkness. But darkness rarely brings silence. A tavern door opens. Someone laughs. Someone argues. A cart rattles in the distance. Then, just for a moment, you hear your own name. Perhaps not. Perhaps only something that sounded like it. Either way, you keep walking. This is the atmosphere in which many controversial ideas survive. Not amid grand persecutions, not beneath dramatic spotlights, but inside uncertainty, inside the uncomfortable feeling that other people may be paying more attention than you would like. The dilemma facing many Gnostic believers was not simply theological. It was social. A belief does not exist in isolation. It lives among neighbors, relatives, merchants, employers, and friends. And once a belief begins separating you from those around you, practical questions emerge. Who can be trusted? What should remain unsaid? How much honesty is too much honesty? The danger was often subtle. A customer stops visiting your stall. A friend grows distant. A relative becomes unusually interested in your opinions. A casual remark returns weeks later in a different context. Nothing dramatic, nothing certain, yet enough to make a person cautious. Cities offered many advantages. They also offered very little privacy. Walls were thin. Courtyards carried sound. Conversations traveled. A secret could remain hidden for years, or disappear overnight. Under such conditions, ideas developed a habit of moving quietly. A text passed discreetly from one household to another. A discussion postponed until fewer ears were nearby. A difficult question asked only among trusted company. The practical side of secrecy rarely appears in philosophy. Yet philosophy often depends upon it. Imagine returning home. The door closes behind you. A lamp burns on a shelf. Somewhere in the room sits a manuscript, perhaps hidden beneath folded clothing, perhaps tucked beneath ordinary household goods. Not because the text possesses magical power, simply because certain books attract unwanted attention. The Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, other writings whose survival often depended on remaining unnoticed. The pages themselves were fragile. Papyrus tears. Ink fades. Bindings loosen. The ideas contained inside proved more durable. Yet even ideas require caretakers. Someone willing to preserve them. Someone willing to risk being associated with them. This raises a deeper, practical question. Why bother? Why preserve teachings that make life more complicated? Why cling to beliefs that may isolate you from the people around you? The answer remains difficult to recover. The surviving sources rarely tell us what ordinary believers felt. Most of what survives was written either by teachers defending these ideas or by critics attacking them. The people in between left fewer traces, yet a possibility emerges from the fragments. Perhaps these beliefs answered something other explanations could not. Perhaps they gave language to an experience that already existed, the feeling that reality was somehow incomplete. The sensation that public certainty concealed deeper confusion. The quiet conviction that something important had been forgotten. A person who feels that way may tolerate a great deal of inconvenience, even loneliness, especially loneliness. The Church Fathers who opposed Gnosticism understood this challenge. Figures such as Irenaeus and Hippolytus devoted enormous effort to arguing against these movements. Their writings survive in remarkable detail. Again and again, they defended a different vision of reality. A good creator, a good creation, a salvation available openly rather than secretly. Their concern was not merely doctrinal, it was communal. If everyone follows private revelations, shared belief becomes difficult. Order begins to fracture. The argument was understandable. So was the response. The Gnostics were often asking questions that official answers did not entirely satisfy. Questions about suffering, questions about alienation, questions about why the world feels both beautiful and broken at the same time. Neither side saw itself as unreasonable, which may be why the disagreement endured. As the night deepens, the city grows quieter. A distant door closes. Footsteps pass through the alley and disappear. The mind begins filling the silence with possibilities. That may be the strangest consequence of suspicion. It transforms ordinary sounds into mysteries. A visitor, a stranger, a friend, a threat. The difference becomes difficult to determine. Many people eventually withdrew from these tensions altogether. Some sought solitude in deserts and remote settlements. Others remained in the cities, carrying their convictions quietly through daily life. Neither path removed the dilemma. Speak openly and risk losing your place among others. Remain silent and carry the weight alone. There are no perfect solutions, only different forms of uncertainty. Perhaps that is why the figure of the heretic continues to fascinate us. Not because heretics are always correct. History offers little support for that idea, but because they occupy a difficult position, standing between belonging and conviction, between safety and honesty, between community and conscience. The narrow street eventually empties. The lamps burn lower. Night settles over the city. Somewhere behind a closed door, a manuscript remains hidden. Somewhere else, a difficult conversation continues. And somewhere beyond both, another question waits patiently. Not whether a belief is dangerous, but why certain beliefs remain impossible to abandon once they have taken root. That question will follow us into the next chapter. The footsteps have faded. The alley lies still, yet the feeling of being watched by larger mysteries remains. Chapter 7. The books that refuse to vanish. History is usually built from survivors. Not the people, not the cities, not even the beliefs. The survivors are often the scraps, a broken inscription, a damaged letter, a page that somehow escaped the fire. The overwhelming majority of human thought disappears without a trace. Entire libraries vanish. Languages fade. Communities leave behind little more than a few scattered names. Gnosticism nearly suffered the same fate. For centuries, it existed mostly as an echo, a movement described by its opponents, a story told from the outside. And then, by accident, the ground gave something back. Picture a hot afternoon in Upper Egypt. The year is 1945. The hills outside Nag Hammadi rise from the landscape in pale folds of stone and dust. Heat settles over everything. The air feels heavy despite its dryness. Every movement seems to require a little more effort than it should. A local farmer named Muhammad Ali is digging near the cliffs, not searching for ancient wisdom, not hunting lost books, simply gathering fertilizer from the rich soil found near the base of the hills. The work is ordinary until the shovel strikes something hollow. A sharp sound, unexpected, the sort of sound that interrupts a day and quietly changes it. Beneath the earth sits a large sealed jar, ancient, heavy, its contents unknown. Stories later emerged about what happened next. Some accounts suggest hesitation. Others mention curiosity. One version claims there was concern that the jar might contain a spirit trapped inside. Whatever the truth, the seal was eventually broken. No treasure spilled out, no gold, no jewels. Instead, there were books, old books, 13 leather-bound codices resting inside the darkness where they had remained undisturbed for more than 15 centuries. To most people, they would have appeared worthless. The pages were fragile, the bindings worn, the language unfamiliar. The smell of dust and age clung to everything. Nothing about the discovery suggested importance. And yet few archaeological finds would alter our understanding of ancient religion more dramatically, because hidden within those codices were texts that had effectively vanished from history. Gospels, treatises, revelations, voices long thought lost. The discovery became known as the Nag Hammadi Library, and in many ways, it transformed the study of Gnosticism overnight. Before 1945, historians faced a peculiar problem. Most information about Gnostic beliefs came from people who opposed them. Church leaders such as Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Epiphanius devoted enormous effort to describing what they considered dangerous teachings. Their writings survive in remarkable detail. The Gnostics themselves, however, remained frustratingly silent. Imagine attempting to understand an entire community using only the complaints written by its enemies. The picture would inevitably become distorted. Not necessarily false, but incomplete. For generations, scholars worked within those limitations. Then the buried books emerged. For the first time, Gnostic voices began speaking directly. Not through critics, not through accusations, through their own words. The effect was startling. Suddenly, texts appeared with titles that sounded almost legendary. The Gospel of Thomas, the Secret Book of John, the Gospel of Truth, the Reality of the Rulers. The names alone seemed to belong to another world. Opening these works did not immediately solve any mysteries. If anything, they created new ones. The texts are difficult, strange, often fragmentary. Some read like philosophical meditations. Others resemble dream narratives. A few unfold as conversations between divine beings whose identities seem to shift from page to page. The experience of reading them can feel surprisingly modern, not because they are easy to understand, but because they resist easy interpretation. Every answer seems to reveal another layer beneath it. A statement becomes a symbol becomes a question. The further one reads, the less certain everything becomes. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why the texts remain so fascinating. They do not behave like lost instruction manuals. They behave like fragments of a larger conversation, whose beginning and ending have gone missing. Yet the most remarkable part of the story may be their survival. Somewhere during the 4th century, someone placed these books inside a jar. Someone carried them into the desert. Someone buried them. And then, apparently, never returned. Why? No one knows for certain. Perhaps religious authorities were becoming less tolerant of alternative teachings. Perhaps the owner feared confiscation. Perhaps the texts were simply hidden during a period of unrest and later forgotten. History rarely explains itself as clearly as we would like. The motivations disappeared. The jar remained. While kingdoms rose and fell, the codices waited underground. The Roman Empire changed. Languages shifted. Religions transformed. Generations passed. Above the burial site, countless lives unfolded and ended without realizing what rested beneath their feet. The silence lasted more than 1,500 years. Then a farmer with a shovel interrupted it. There is something almost unsettling about how much history depends upon chance. Move the jar a few meters in another direction. Leave it exposed to moisture. Break it accidentally. Fail to recognize its value. Any one of those possibilities could have erased the discovery entirely. Our modern understanding of Gnosticism hangs, in part, on a chain of accidents. A jar, a hillside, a fortunate excavation. That reality forces a humbling thought. How much has been lost forever? For every surviving manuscript, how many disappeared? For every preserved voice, how many fell silent? The Nag Hammadi texts revealed a great deal. They also revealed the scale of our ignorance. The books did not uncover a single hidden religion. They uncovered diversity, disagreement, competing interpretations. Some writings focus on cosmic drama. Others emphasize personal awakening. Certain texts appear unmistakably Christian. Others seem only loosely connected. The closer scholars looked, the harder it became to treat Gnosticism as one unified thing. The fragments multiplied. The puzzle grew larger. And perhaps that is exactly what makes the discovery so compelling. Not because it delivered certainty, but because it restored complexity. The buried books did not answer every question. They returned the questions to the people who originally asked them. As evening settles over the Nile Valley, It is easy to imagine the jar still resting beneath the sand, silent, patient, waiting. Not for centuries this time, only for the next curious hand. The codices eventually found their way into museums, libraries, and scholarly debates. Yet something of their long burial remains attached to them. The feeling that they emerged from a place beyond ordinary memory, recovered, but not entirely explained. And in the next chapter, those recovered voices will begin drawing the maps they believed led beyond the visible world. Strange maps. Incomplete maps. Maps that point toward a home no traveler can quite remember. Chapter 8. Cosmic Maps and Crooked Roads. Human beings have always drawn maps. Some describe rivers. Some describe trade routes. Some describe the distance between one city and the next. The Gnostics attempted something far more ambitious. They tried to map the distance between this world and whatever lay beyond it. The result was not a single diagram. It was a collection of strange and often contradictory visions. Worlds stacked upon worlds. Invisible realms layered above ordinary reality. Hidden gates. Watchful powers. Roads that seem to lead simultaneously inward and outward. To modern eyes, these cosmologies can appear bewildering. Yet beneath all the complexity rests a surprisingly familiar feeling. The sense of being lost, and the hope that somewhere, somehow, a path home still exists. Imagine a traveler walking a road at dusk. The light is fading. Dust rises softly beneath worn sandals. The stones underfoot grow harder to distinguish with every passing minute. Somewhere ahead, the road divides, though the signs marking the way have long since fallen. The traveler pauses, listens, looks toward the darkening horizon, then chooses a direction without fully knowing whether it is correct. That uncertainty sits at the heart of many Gnostic visions of the universe. According to numerous Gnostic traditions, reality was not a single unified place. It was layered. The visible world occupied only one level of a much larger structure. Beyond it stretched a series of spiritual realms, each separated by boundaries, powers, and mysteries. The material world sat near the bottom. Above it rose increasingly subtle levels of existence, and beyond them all rested the fullness of divine reality. The destination varied depending on the text. The journey did not. Again and again, the soul appears as a traveler, a wanderer moving through unfamiliar territory. A stranger, trying to remember a forgotten route. Some of the surviving texts become remarkably detailed when describing these realms. The Apocryphon of John, for example, presents a universe populated by divine emanations, powers, rulers, and cosmic hierarchies, whose relationships sometimes feel closer to a dream than a diagram. Names multiply. Realms unfold from other realms. Structures emerge inside larger structures. The more closely one studies the map, the more labyrinthine it becomes. At times, it feels less like theology and more like someone attempting to sketch the architecture of a vision before it fades. One recurring feature appears throughout many of these systems: the archons, the rulers, the guardian standing between worlds. Their role shifts from text to text, but the basic image remains surprisingly consistent. The soul cannot simply wander wherever it pleases. There are checkpoints, boundaries, barriers, figures who ask questions, figures who demand recognition, figures who seem determined to slow the journey. The imagery can feel almost bureaucratic, as though the cosmos itself has somehow developed administration. One cannot help imagining an exhausted traveler arriving at a celestial gate, only to discover another form still needs to be completed. There is something unexpectedly human about this. Even ancient spiritual visions seem unable to escape paperwork. Yet beneath the humor lies a serious idea. Knowledge functions as passage. Recognition functions as movement. To know where you are is to take one step closer to knowing where you belong. This is where the concept of gnosis returns once again. The maps were never merely descriptions of geography. They were descriptions of understanding. Every barrier represented ignorance. Every threshold represented awakening. Every gate symbolized a deeper level of recognition. The road home passed through the self as much as through the cosmos. That distinction is easy to miss. Many modern readers become fascinated by the architecture of these systems. The levels, the names, the passwords, the secret signs. Yet the deeper purpose appears to be transformation. The maps matter because they describe a process of remembering, not merely a route, a change in awareness. Still, the practical imagination behind these cosmologies remains captivating. One can picture a Gnostic scribe bent over a wooden table late at night. A lamp burns beside him. Ink darkens the edge of his thumb. He pauses over a complicated diagram, trying to organize powers and realms that seem determined to resist organization. One line connects to another, then another. Soon the page resembles a network of pathways crossing in every direction. The universe begins looking less like a kingdom and more like a maze. Perhaps that is why the maps resonate. Life often feels that way. People rarely move through existence in straight lines. They become lost. They double back. They follow directions that turn out to be wrong. They discover that certainty is often little more than a confidence wearing a disguise. The Gnostic traveler faces the same difficulty. The map exists, yet the path remains uncertain, and the surviving maps disagree with one another constantly. Some traditions describe 7 heavens. Others describe 12. Some multiply the realms until counting becomes difficult. Others simplify the structure entirely. Reading them side by side can feel like listening to travelers argue over roads neither can fully remember. No, after the gate of silence, you continue upward. No, upward comes later. No, you've mistaken that realm for another one entirely. The debates never quite end. In a curious way, this makes the cosmologies feel more believable. Real maps disagree too, especially when they attempt to chart unfamiliar territory. Perhaps the most haunting feature of these spiritual diagrams is what happens when they stop. Certain texts leave questions unanswered. Certain journeys remain unfinished. The traveler disappears before reaching the destination. The route fades into uncertainty. No explanation follows. At first, this can feel frustrating, then oddly comforting, because uncertainty survives even in sacred geography. Even cosmic maps contain blank spaces. Even the grandest visions leave room for mystery. Not every road is fully charted. Not every destination is described. Some portions of the journey remain hidden. Perhaps they always will. And yet the traveler continues. One foot in dust. One eye on distant horizons. Following signs that may or may not point in the right direction. Hoping the next turn reveals something familiar. The Gnostics understood something simple and deeply human. When the world feels confusing, people search for maps. Not because maps guarantee arrival, but because they make wandering feel meaningful. As night settles across the road, the traveler keeps moving. The stars emerge overhead. The crossroads recede behind. Somewhere ahead, beyond the visible landscape, waits a place remembered more by longing than by memory. The road bends toward it. Slowly, uncertainly, and the journey continues. Chapter 9. Thresholds and Quiet Rituals. Not every ritual begins in a temple. Many begin in kitchens, at doorways, beside wash basins, in the ordinary spaces where daily life unfolds almost unnoticed. The surviving Gnostic texts suggest that this was often true for them as well. When modern people hear the word ritual, they tend to imagine elaborate ceremonies, robes, processions, crowds gathered beneath painted ceilings. Yet much of what we know about Gnostic practice points in a quieter direction. Small actions, repeated actions, moments that transformed familiar routines into reminders of a hidden reality. If Gnosticism was rooted in the feeling that the visible world concealed something deeper, then ritual became a way of stepping, however briefly, across that invisible boundary. Not escaping the world, simply looking at it differently. The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Fragments survive. References survive. Hints survive. But the full picture remains elusive. Many instructions arrive half-finished. Many explanations seem to assume knowledge the reader no longer possesses. The result is less like reading a manual and more like discovering a handful of pages torn from the middle of a much larger book. Still, certain patterns emerge. Water appears frequently. Oil appears frequently. Names, blessings, acts of preparation, moments of symbolic transition. One can begin to sense the outline of practices that once carried enormous significance for the people performing them. Imagine a small room after sunset. A lamp burns softly against the wall. A bowl of water rests on a table. The room is quiet enough that even small sounds seem important. The movement of fabric, the settling of wood, the faint crackle of the flame. A person lowers their hands into the water. Nothing dramatic happens. The water remains water. The room remains the same. And yet, within a ritual context, the act becomes something more. A gesture toward cleansing, a gesture toward awakening, a reminder that visible actions can point toward invisible meanings. This pattern appears throughout Gnostic thought. Ordinary things become symbols. Simple movements become reflections of larger realities. The boundary between everyday life and spiritual life grows thin. A meal becomes more than a meal. A lamp becomes more than a lamp. Even a spoken name may carry meanings hidden beneath its surface. Among the practices mentioned in surviving texts are forms of baptism, but these were not always the public ceremonies many people associate with Christianity. Some descriptions suggest more private settings, smaller gatherings, initiations surrounded by layers of symbolism. Water remained important, yet the emphasis often appears to fall not on the water itself, but on what it represented, crossing from one condition into another, leaving behind ignorance, moving toward recognition, toward gnosis, toward remembering. Certain texts suggest that initiates sometimes received new names. Whether this occurred literally, symbolically, or both remains difficult to determine. The sources rarely provide straightforward answers, yet the idea itself is revealing. A new name implies a new identity, or perhaps the recovery of an older one, something forgotten being restored, a truth hidden beneath the ordinary self. Again and again, Gnostic imagery returns to this theme. Not becoming something new, remembering what was always there. The practical side of ritual is equally fascinating. Many traditions appear to have believed that specific words possessed power, not because language itself was magical, but because knowledge and recognition were central to salvation. To know the correct name, to recognize the correct sign, to understand the meaning behind a symbol. These things mattered. Some texts describe passwords, formulas, and sacred names associated with different cosmic powers. Reading these passages today can feel surprisingly bureaucratic. One almost imagines the soul approaching a distant gate, only to discover another question waiting, another challenge, another threshold. The image is strangely charming. Even the heavens, it seems, may involve paperwork. Yet beneath the complexity lies a simple hope. Knowledge creates passage. Recognition creates movement. Understanding opens doors. Whether those doors exist within the cosmos or within the self remains one of the great unanswered questions. The rituals themselves often seem designed to reinforce that possibility. A repeated phrase, a repeated gesture, a repeated act of remembrance. The power may not reside in the action alone. It may reside in the rhythm. Human beings have always been creatures of repetition. We return to familiar songs, familiar paths, familiar habits. There is comfort in doing something the same way twice, then 3 times, then 100. The repetition creates structure. Structure creates familiarity. And familiarity can become a form of shelter. The Gnostics appear to have understood this instinct well. For people who viewed themselves as strangers within the world, Ritual offered a temporary sense of orientation, a small point of stability, a reminder that meaning could still be found amid uncertainty. Yet uncertainty never disappears entirely. Many of the surviving texts carry a faint undercurrent of hesitation, as though the writers themselves understood how fragile these practices were. What if the words are forgotten? What if the symbols are misunderstood? What if the ritual survives but the meaning slips away? The concern feels surprisingly human. Anyone who has inherited an old tradition knows the feeling. The gestures remain. The explanation fades. The form survives. The purpose becomes harder to grasp. Perhaps no example illustrates this better than the mysterious bridal chamber mentioned in the Gospel of Philip. Few subjects have generated more debate. Was it an actual ritual? A symbolic teaching? A spiritual metaphor? Scholars continue arguing. The evidence refuses to settle the matter. The text gestures towards something important, then steps back into shadow, like a doorway glimpsed at the end of a corridor. Visible, yet unreachable. In some ways, that uncertainty captures the spirit of Gnosticism itself. The threshold matters as much as the destination. The searching matters as much as the finding. The reminder matters as much as the answer. As the evening deepens, the lamp continues to burn. The bowl remains on the table. A cloth is folded carefully and set aside for tomorrow. The actions themselves are simple, almost forgettable. Yet through repetition, they become something else. Markers along a road. Small signals passed from one day to the next. Not proof, not certainty, only reminders. The world may be deeper than it appears. The door may still be there, and somewhere between habit and memory, between ritual and recognition, another threshold quietly waits. The hand reaches for it. The question remains, and the journey continues. Chapter 10. Echoes in the pulpit. Ideas rarely remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, they leave the small room. They leave the whispered conversation. They leave the secret book folded beneath a cloth. And once they enter public life, they begin colliding with other ideas already waiting there. This is what happened to Gnosticism. For a time, its questions remained largely private. Then the questions grew louder. And so did the responses. Imagine a church at dawn. The stone walls still hold the night's coolness. Light enters through narrow windows and spreads slowly across the floor. The scent of incense lingers in the air, mixing with damp stone, wax, and the faint smell of wet wool carried in by the congregation. People gather quietly. A merchant, a widow, a laborer, a traveler stopping only briefly before continuing down the road. Most have come seeking the same thing: certainty, or at least something close to it. A voice rises from the front of the room, steady, confident, measured. The sermon begins, and somewhere within it, a warning appears. Not about invading armies, not about famine, about ideas. The history of Gnosticism is often told as a battle between competing beliefs. There is some truth in that. Yet the reality was less dramatic and more human than the phrase suggests. At its heart stood a disagreement about reality itself. What kind of world is this? Who created it? How is salvation found? Can hidden knowledge reveal truths unavailable to ordinary teaching? These questions carried consequences far beyond philosophy, because beliefs do not stay inside books. They shape communities. They shape institutions. They shape how people live together. By the 2nd century, Christianity was becoming increasingly organized. Church leaders sought to establish common teachings that could unite believers across enormous distances. Shared texts, shared doctrines, shared answers. The task was difficult enough without dozens of competing interpretations emerging at the same time, and Gnostic groups offered some of the most challenging alternatives. This is where figures like Irenaeus enter the story. Bishop of Lyon, writer, theologian, and one of the most determined critics of Gnostic thought. Around the year 180, he composed a massive work known as Against Heresies. Its purpose was straightforward. Identify teachings he believed were dangerous, describe them, refute them, prevent them from spreading further. The resulting text remains one of the most important sources for understanding early Christianity, and one of the reasons we know anything about many Gnostic groups at all. There is an irony in that. Some movements survive largely because their opponents documented them so carefully. Without Irenaeus, entire chapters of religious history might have disappeared completely. Yet reading his work reveals something beyond disagreement, a sense of urgency. He was not arguing against abstract theories. He believed these ideas threatened the spiritual well-being of real communities. For him, the stakes were enormous. The sermons reflected that concern. One can imagine a congregation listening as a preacher describes hidden teachings and secret revelations. Warnings follow, cautions, occasionally ridicule. The Gnostics are portrayed as confused, misguided, dangerously mistaken. The audience nods. Some agree completely. Others remain uncertain. Not everyone listens in the same way. At the back of the room, a merchant may be thinking about rising prices rather than theology. Another listener may be quietly wondering whether the forbidden ideas are as foolish as they sound. A third may have already encountered them. Public belief is never quite as uniform as it appears. Even the most authoritative sermon cannot fully control what happens inside another person's mind. And so disagreement continues. Not always openly, often quietly, in marketplaces, at dinner tables, along roads traveled between cities. Most conflicts over belief never reach official records. They survive instead as small social pressures. A neighbor becomes distant. A conversation grows awkward. An invitation fails to arrive. Someone acquires a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions. The mechanisms are subtle, yet remarkably effective. Communities rarely require formal punishment to encourage conformity. Sometimes disapproval is enough. A cold glance, a hesitant silence, the sense that one has stepped slightly outside the circle. These forces helped shape the fate of Gnostic traditions. Not every text was destroyed. Not every believer was persecuted. But over time, the space available for alternative teachings narrowed. Orthodox Christianity gained structure. Authority expanded. Boundaries hardened. Ideas once debated became increasingly settled. And those who continued challenging the consensus found themselves pushed toward the margins. Occasionally, the process became more visible. Books were condemned. Writings were excluded. Lists circulated identifying acceptable texts and unacceptable ones. A manuscript copied carefully for generations could suddenly become dangerous to possess. The image is easy to picture. A scroll carried from a shelf. A decision made. Pages committed to the fire. The smell of smoke drifting across a courtyard. The loss rarely announces its future significance. At the time, it is simply another document disappearing. Only centuries later does anyone realize what vanished with it. Yet complete erasure never quite occurs. Ideas are stubborn. They migrate. They adapt. They leave traces behind. Certain questions survive long after the communities that first asked them have faded. Fragments of language reappear. Symbols acquire new meanings. Old concerns find new expressions. The visible movement declines. The underlying curiosity remains. Perhaps that is why Gnosticism continues to exert such fascination. The official arguments against it succeeded in many respects. The organized communities largely disappeared. The texts were hidden. The teachers were forgotten. And still the questions survived. Why does the world feel both beautiful and broken? Why do people experience such profound alienation? Can reality contain depths that ordinary explanations fail to reach? No sermon has ever permanently settled those questions. The echoes continue, not only within churches, within people. As the morning service draws to a close, the congregation begins to disperse. Footsteps echo across stone floors. Doors open. Sunlight spills into the street. Life resumes its ordinary rhythms. Work, trade, meals, conversations. The preacher's voice fades. Yet somewhere near the edge of the crowd, someone remains thoughtful. A question lingers. Not answered. Not dismissed. Simply carried forward. And that may be the most enduring echo of all. The forbidden question survives, moving quietly from one generation to the next, waiting patiently for another listener willing to follow it a little further. Chapter 11. The Afterlives of Gnosis. Most ideas do not die. They fade. They scatter. They leave traces in places nobody thinks to look. The afterlife of Gnosticism is not the story of a religion surviving unchanged through the centuries. It is something stranger than that. A story of fragments, of echoes, of questions that refuse to stay buried. By the time many Gnostic communities disappeared, their books had already begun vanishing. Their teachers were forgotten, their meeting places abandoned. Their names survived mostly in the writings of people who opposed them. From a distance, it would be reasonable to assume the story ended there. History is full of movements that leave little behind. Yet Gnosticism has a peculiar habit of returning, not always in recognizable form, often not even under its own name. Imagine a scholar sitting beneath the glow of a desk lamp. The year is 1947. The air smells faintly of dust and old paper. Spread across the table lies a fragment from the recently discovered Nag Hammadi texts. The papyrus is damaged. Water has erased portions of the writing. Fibers separate at the edges. Entire sections have vanished into silence. The scholar leans closer. A word appears, then disappears. A sentence begins, then breaks apart halfway through. The missing spaces seem almost deliberate, as though the text has chosen to reveal only enough to remain mysterious. There is something fitting about that. The history of Gnosticism itself often resembles a damaged manuscript. Enough survives to glimpse the outline. Not enough survives to complete the picture. The gaps become part of the story. And those gaps create a problem. The more historians studied these texts, the more difficult a simple definition became. What exactly was Gnosticism? A religion? A collection of movements? A family of ideas? A category invented later by scholars attempting to organize an unruly past? The debate continues. Some researchers have argued that the term itself may be too broad, too convenient, too willing to gather very different groups beneath a single label. The surviving texts disagree with one another constantly. The communities appear diverse. The boundaries refuse to remain fixed. The closer one looks, the harder certainty becomes. And yet something remains recognizable. A recurring mood, a recurring question, a recurring sense that reality contains a hidden depth waiting just beyond ordinary perception. That atmosphere survives even when the labels disappear. Perhaps that is why Gnostic ideas proved so difficult to extinguish. Not because specific teachings spread unchanged, because certain themes continued resurfacing. The image of a flawed world, the longing for a forgotten home, the suspicion that visible reality conceals something deeper, the hope that awakening is possible. These ideas traveled surprisingly well. Some appeared within the religion founded by the prophet Mani, whose followers developed an elaborate vision of light trapped within darkness. Others seem to echo faintly through certain mystical traditions, where hidden realities and divine sparks continue to appear in new forms. Elements resembling Gnostic themes have been identified in later esoteric movements, Renaissance speculation, occult traditions, and modern spiritual philosophies. The connections are not always direct. Sometimes they are little more than family resemblances, a shared gesture rather than a shared lineage. A similar question asked centuries apart. This distinction matters. The temptation is always to draw straight lines through history, to imagine ideas moving neatly from one generation to the next. Reality tends to be messier. More often, concepts disappear and reappear. They dissolve into the cultural landscape and emerge later in unexpected places, like seeds carried by the wind. Some land on fertile ground, others vanish. A few survive in forms their original creators would barely recognize. The notion of a divine spark provides a good example. It has surfaced repeatedly throughout history, sometimes attached to ancient cosmologies, sometimes attached to modern spirituality. The language changes. The context changes. The emotional appeal remains remarkably consistent. People seem drawn to the possibility that something within them belongs to a reality larger than the one surrounding them. The idea keeps finding new homes, even when its original framework has been forgotten. What fascinates me most is how often Gnostic themes appear where no historical connection can be proven at all. A poet describing exile, a philosopher questioning the reliability of the senses, a novelist imagining hidden worlds beneath ordinary reality, a person standing in the middle of a crowded city and feeling strangely out of place. The emotional pattern returns, again and again. Not necessarily because these people encountered ancient Gnostic texts, because they encountered the same human experience. The feeling that something is missing, the sense that the visible world may not be the whole story. That feeling appears older than any movement. Gnosticism simply gave it a particularly memorable form. Of course, tracing these afterlives can become frustrating. The further one follows the trail, the less solid it becomes. Definitions blur. Connections weaken. Every apparent influence generates 3 new questions. Soon, Gnosticism seems to be everywhere, then nowhere, then everywhere again. The phenomenon begins to resemble a shadow moving across uneven ground, visible from certain angles, gone from others. Scholars continue debating where the boundaries belong. Ordinary readers continue recognizing familiar themes regardless. The arguments persist. The questions persist. The longing persists. And perhaps that longing is the true inheritance. Not a doctrine, not a ritual, not even a collection of texts. A feeling. A particular kind of homesickness. The sensation that reality is somehow incomplete. That a larger story exists beyond the visible one. That something forgotten waits just beyond memory. No manuscript can resolve that feeling completely. No archaeological discovery can erase it. The buried books gave us voices. The centuries that followed gave us echoes. Both matter. Neither provides a final answer. As the night grows quieter, it becomes easier to understand why these ideas endured. Not because they were victorious, not because they were preserved perfectly, but because they attached themselves to questions human beings never seem to stop asking. The names change. The symbols change. The world changes. Yet the question remains. Why does existence feel so familiar and so foreign at the same time? The old Gnostics offered one answer. Others offered different ones. The conversation continues. Somewhere, another reader opens a forgotten book. Somewhere else, someone stares out a window and wonders whether the world is deeper than it appears. The afterlife of Gnosis lives in moments like these, half remembered, half imagined, still moving, still unfinished. And somewhere ahead, the final chapter waits beside that same enduring question, patient as ever, ready to return once more. Chapter 12. The Weight of Knowing. Eventually, every road circles back to the same question. Not what the world is, not who created it, not even whether hidden truths exist, but what happens after you begin looking for them. That may be the quietest question in all of Gnosticism, and perhaps the most human. Over the course of this journey, we have followed travelers beneath unfamiliar stars. We have wandered marketplaces crowded with competing truths. We have stood beside hidden books, crossed uncertain thresholds, and listened to old arguments echo through stone halls long after the voices themselves faded. Yet all of those stories point towards something remarkably simple: the burden of knowing, or perhaps the burden of wanting to know. Imagine a road after midnight. Not an ancient road this time, just a road. The pavement still holds a little warmth from the day. Pebbles rest in the cracks. Weeds push through places where they are not supposed to grow. Far away, scattered lights glow at the edge of the horizon. The city is still awake, only quieter now. A distant dog barks once and falls silent. Somewhere a window remains lit. The air carries the faint scent of rain that may never arrive. You walk without hurrying. There is nowhere particular to reach. Only the road. Only the questions. This is where thoughts tend to gather. Not in crowded rooms. Not during busy afternoons, but during the strange hours when the world loosens its grip on certainty. The Gnostics understood that feeling well. Their entire worldview begins with a discomfort that most people have experienced at least once. The suspicion that things do not quite add up. The feeling that reality contains an unanswered question hidden somewhere beneath its surface. Most people eventually move on. The feeling passes. The day resumes. The bills need paying. The roof leaks. The bread burns if left unattended. Life continues. The Gnostics chose a different response. They took the feeling seriously, perhaps too seriously. They wondered whether the discomfort itself was evidence, whether alienation pointed toward a forgotten origin, whether homesickness implied the existence of a home. The questions grew larger from there. Soon, they encompassed the entire universe. The stars, the soul, creation itself. Yet something curious happens when people pursue hidden knowledge. The answers rarely bring the peace they expect. Often, they bring new questions instead. Knowledge has weight. Every discovery changes the shape of ignorance without eliminating it. The horizon simply moves farther away. The old Gnostic texts understand this better than many modern readers realize. People sometimes approach them expecting certainty, a secret explanation, a final revelation, a hidden key capable of unlocking every mystery. What they find instead is layer upon layer of complexity. One question leads to another. One answer opens a door into a larger puzzle. The universe grows deeper, not simpler. Perhaps that is why so many of these writings feel dreamlike. They are less concerned with solving reality than awakening curiosity about it. The journey matters more than the conclusion. The search matters more than the destination. There is wisdom in that, and there is exhaustion in it too. After all, people still have to live. The body still demands attention. Hunger remains hunger. Fatigue remains fatigue. The leaking roof remains stubbornly real regardless of one's opinion of the Demiurge. This tension appears everywhere in the history of Gnosticism. The longing for transcendence, the persistence of ordinary life. A person may spend the evening contemplating hidden realms and wake the next morning needing to repair a fence. The soul may belong to eternity. The sandals still need mending. There is something strangely comforting about that. The ancient Gnostics were not floating abstractions. They worried about food, about weather, about illness, about money, about difficult neighbors. The same people discussing divine sparks and cosmic prisons still had to bargain in markets and carry water home. The mystery existed alongside the mundane. Neither replaced the other. And perhaps that is the real lesson hidden beneath centuries of speculation. Not that the world is an illusion. Not that secret knowledge solves everything, but that human beings continue searching even when certainty remains out of reach. The search itself becomes meaningful, a way of living with unanswered questions, a way of carrying uncertainty without letting it become despair. The old texts often speak of awakening. Yet there is another skill they quietly suggest. Learning when to rest. Learning when to stop searching for a few hours. Learning how to let the mystery remain mysterious. The road stretches ahead. The city lights flicker in the distance. The questions remain where they have always been. Waiting, patient, unresolved. And perhaps that is acceptable. Perhaps the goal was never to possess every answer. Perhaps it was simply to become aware that the questions existed. The weight of knowing is uneven. Sometimes it feels like setting down a heavy burden. Sometimes it feels like picking one up. Sometimes it is trillion at once. The world does not become less complicated because we recognize its mysteries. Yet something changes. The familiar acquires depth. Ordinary moments begin carrying echoes. A night sky. A quiet room. A forgotten book. A road after midnight. The same world remains. Yet it feels slightly different. as though another layer has become visible beneath the first. The Gnostics would likely recognize that feeling. Whether they were correct is another matter entirely. History cannot answer every question. Neither can philosophy, neither can faith. Some uncertainties remain, and perhaps they should. The road eventually bends out of sight. The distant lights grow softer. The night deepens. Tomorrow will arrive with its ordinary demands. Bread to bake, messages to answer, work to finish. The world, stubbornly and beautifully, will continue being itself. For now, though, the questions can rest. The traveler can rest. The stars can remain unexplained. And somewhere between knowing and not knowing, between certainty and wonder, the story comes gently to an end. Not with an answer, but with a quiet understanding that human beings have always searched for meaning beneath the surface of things, and that the search itself may be one of the oldest stories ever told. Sleep well. The road will still be here tomorrow. There is a playlist on screen now, if you would like to keep drifting through stories like this a little longer. You do not have to choose much. You can simply let the next story play whenever you are ready.